One of the things we want to talk about right out the bat is timing, because when you have an estate plan or a trust, you might be considering an exit. So, is there a right time to talk about your estate or your trust when you have a business and you're thinking about selling it? And is there a case also for waiting until after you sell your business and you take an exit?
So I think it's important at the outset to talk about estate planning, the different types what people might be thinking of when they hear this, right? So I think about estate planning as having two separate buckets. One being purely the contingency planning, getting your will done, getting your basic living trust done. In California, people are doing living trusts, the basic documents that everybody needs that says, where your stuff goes when you die, versus irrevocable trust planning, tax planning, which is more the type of planning that I would consider advanced planning, a tax planning. This is the type of planning that you need to think about when you're thinking about an exit. So, the first bucket, you always need that done, and it doesn't matter timing. Get that done as soon as you can. If you have any assets at all, right? I think for the purposes of today, get that done. But for the second category of trust planning and things like that, the sooner the better is really the answer, right? And that doesn't always get done because sometimes clients don't know that they need to be planning, doing tax planning before the exit, or sometimes they are so embroiled in the planning and the negotiations and all that stuff that it's just not a priority, right? They're circulating term sheets, they're doing all this kind of stuff. That's not there on their mind. But there are some planning techniques that are timing dependent and where certain doors will be closed if you waited too long. Others, the door hasn't closed at past a certain point, but the earlier the better, from a tax savings evaluation perspective, and also just from a practicality perspective as well, which is we get clients calling all the time, 2 weeks before, a secondary sale, or 2 weeks before something's happening. And it's hard, even if we can do the work, it's really stressful. You're not doing your best thinking and planning if you're under the gun. So it's really great if you can get out in front of it as early as you can, ideally 6 months in advance.
Okay.
So in addition to the when, Andrea, how about the where? As you think about this, I know there are a handful of states where, because there's no state tax, there are positives to having residency in it. Does it make a difference in terms of a liquidity event, which state you are a resident of?
So there's a couple ways this comes up in the planning that I do, right? One is just where you are, domiciled as a taxpayer, right? My clients are California taxpayers, very disadvantageous from a tax perspective. And so there's not a whole lot you can do to stop that. There are people who expatriate out of California to Nevada, Florida, Texas for income tax purpose. And that's kind of that's really moving your whole life. And we can talk more about that. But, and then from my perspective, it comes down to, again, these trusts planning. So for example, I have a lot of clients who want to create irrevocable trusts, for the purposes of increasing their exemption for qualified small business stock sales, QSBS planning. And they have a certain amount, $10 million of exemption, and they want to stack or increase their exemption by creating irrevocable trusts for family members or friends. They'll often create those trusts in Nevada so that because there's no QSBS exemption for state law purposes, it's just a federal law. So they say, well, I'm going to use my QSBS exemption. I'm going to create more exemption. And then let's situs or place this trust so that the trust has a domicile for tax purposes in Nevada. And that way there's zero tax on this transaction. So there's rules and there's complications that arise when you do that, but it's very common for people to establish trusts in other jurisdictions for tax purposes, and mainly for tax purposes.
I'm wondering about Is so you mentioned Nevada as a state to do that in, right? Are there any
Mhm.
other well, I feel like there's other than Vegas, which has a lot going on. Do you need to go back to that state like once a year or whatever your state you're going in? You're domiciling your trust in, or are there any other like odd requirements?
So when your trust is going to, if you're going to have a trust that has a situs, we call it a situs, or that's in another jurisdiction, the requirement is that the trustee of the trust be in that jurisdiction. That's what creates the trust domicile. Is where does the trustee, I think, is the manager of the trust, the CEO, the president of the trust
Yeah.
document. So they have to be physically located in that state. And so that can be done either there's trust companies, right? So this is a big industry in South Dakota. There's a ton of trust companies, probably
Oh.
Delaware. Nevada has a ton. Alaska, where there's, it's just sort of like on an international level, like you might think of with the Cook Islands or the Caymans or something, right? So there's all these trust companies, or if you have a friend or, somebody who can do the work in another state, you can do that, but they have to be there. The client themselves never has to go there. And it's important to note that at least with California, how California taxes trust plays into it, right? So I can't speak for if you're a Massachusetts resident and you have a trust in Nevada. I don't know what Massachusetts does with that, but for California, of course, California is still going to tax any income that's California source income, right? So if you have a business in California, California is still going to tax that. It doesn't matter where the trust is. That's number one. And then, who the beneficiaries are may cause taxation as well. So if you have California beneficiaries, depending on how the trust is drafted and depending on how the distributions come out, there's probably going to be some California tax as well. So it's pretty complicated.
Yeah. The South Dakota surprises me. I wonder how they decided on that one.
Well, I mean, it's not that surprising if you think about if you again zoom it out to sort of the Cayman Islands or the Cook Islands, right? You have these kind of international tax havens, right? And why did they do that? Is it because they really hate taxes? No, they don't have other industries, right? I think the Cayman Islands' biggest industry was rope at one point, maybe turtle meat, right? And so they need something to bring in some dollars so they can attract, Switzerland, probably the same thing. So South Dakota, I don't know what their big industries are, but I imagine that's it's not a very populous state, so they make same. I'm sure Delaware's the same thing. You make great corporate tax laws, and then everybody wants to incorporate there. So
Panama too, I think.
What's that?
Panama too.
Yeah, exactly.